Welcome to your pre-recorded session on practice designs. For this session, you will listen to 4 coaches discuss what they consider when they design their practices, what type of practices they typically use and avoid, and their reasons for doing this. These coaches will introduce themselves in the recording, but it's important to understand that between them, they have about 50 years of coaching experience and are all highly qualified coaches in their sport. I'm confident this recording will help you understand different ways you can design practices and the strengths and limitations of these approaches. However, if you're finding some of the material a little difficult at this stage, then you can always ask me to clarify any points. Most of the conversation went well, but you'll notice we had a technical issue with James, which meant he broke up a little near the start and then spoke without his camera on for most of the recording. You can either watch this video or minimize the screen and just listen to it. Whichever approach you pick, we'd like you to consider the following questions. Which practice design types did the coaches favour and why? What were the intended reasons for the coaches' practice design types? Why did the coaches dismiss or not prefer particular practice design types? And if you could ask the coaches 1 or 2 questions based on practice design, what would it be? I hope you enjoyed the recording and this helps you understand practice design a little more. And this is definitely a recording you can come back to later on once you've understood the different topics we're focusing on in this module. I hope you enjoy and find this recording useful.
Okay, so welcome to our video call conversation around practice designs. Before we really get into this, I think it'd be good if all of the coaches on the screen just spend 20 seconds or so introducing themselves, so kind of their name and their background and what they do. So on my screen, we'll go top left all the way around. So Connor, I'm going to start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name's Connor, currently coaching at Cribs Football Club up in Bristol. Background is I played a little bit kind of coming through, but I've gone into coaching quite early on in my career. So I'm about 10 years into that kind of journey now as well.
Okay, thank you, Connor. And Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex. I've been involved in coaching since I was 16, so just over 11 years now. So when I finished playing, decided I wanted to go into coaching, and I've worked with kids all the way from 6 years old up to, I work with adults now as well, coaching men's team at Clevedon Town, and also coach with under 6s to under 8s at Southampton Football Club with the local development centre. So quite a range from all ages really, and learned quite a lot in a short space of time.
Okay, thank you. And James?
Hi, I'm James. I've been coaching for about 11 years as well in sort of grassroots, predominantly at Keynsham Town Juniors, where I've coached every age group from under 6 to under 15s and 16s. And I coach the Bath and Wiltshire county team as well, so with a sort of slightly different audience of kids who are sort of somewhere, I suppose, between, well, just rep football. So it's a couple of different levels, but in the junior game, and I've been there about 10, 11 years, so still plenty to do.
Okay, thank you, James. And Gary?
Hi, I'm Gary. I'm the odd one out here. I coach basketball. I've been coaching for about 20 years, so it's going to show my age now. I'm full-time. I run a club called Taunton Tigers based at Rich Jewish. Background, I've coached at all levels, or been involved at all levels. So I've coached from your traditional in your school to your local club, but I've also been involved with the national setup with England 15s, and I've had some experience coaching abroad as well.
So thank you very much, Gary. So just some context to this video. We've got 3 football coaches and 1 basketball coach. That doesn't matter because the sport is completely irrelevant. What we're exploring today is different ways that we might design practices. So what I've come up with is some questions that I'm going to ask these group of coaches, and then they're going to have some conversations around those questions, and we'll see where it goes. What's really important to note as well, that not only are all 4 of these coaches experienced and heavily experienced, but they're also all highly qualified. So they're all level 3 coaches in their sports. So in terms of their understanding around practice designs, please take as much as you can from them because it is very extensive, apart from Connor maybe, but everyone else, yeah, very extensive. So the first question I'm going to throw out, and I'm just going to kind of leave it to you to how you want to discuss this and who wants to go first and how you kind of play off each other a little bit. Just want to explore what is important to you when you design your practices. So not necessarily the session as a whole, but if we break it down to individual practices within a session, what's important to you in terms of what you consider when you design your practices?
I don't mind kicking off. I think with the design, for me, I think one of the key focuses I look at when I'm designing is try and find a way to keep every participant engaged towards the main goal as much as possible. So whilst you might be focusing on one specific thing, it might even be with one specific player or a specific unit or group. I think finding a way to keep the whole group engaged towards that main goal, if you like, is probably one of the main things that I try and design to get that outcome. It's not easy to do sometimes, especially when it's quite specific, but I think that's really important to me. Anyone else?
No, I agree with Alex. And I think depending on the age to a certain degree, I think it's about communicating those goals and making sure the players are alongside that so that they stay engaged with that. It's very easy sometimes just to drift within the session, and which is fine as long as you come back to whatever your outcome might be. And I think during some of the practices as well, it's sometimes good to reinforce that and get the players to reinforce that and find a way of doing that and being creative with doing that, empowering them as well, I guess.
Yeah, I think
there's quite a lot of.
Go on, James.
Oh, sorry, Con. I was just going to say there's quite a lot of different schools of thought on whether you should coach a session to an outcome or let it flow organically and kind of see where it goes. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that, but I do think that having a topic or a session that sits in some sort of bigger picture, so that if it does go off what you originally planned your outcome to be, but you're seeing stuff that still fits within what you're trying to develop or where you want your team and your players to get to, I suppose, is worth having an idea. So perhaps thinking of one topic, but having a wider view of things that might come out of it, so that if it doesn't necessarily go to plan, you haven't wasted a session, you're actually just letting it go and picking up some value in something else that might kind of organically come about. That just made me think of that, actually, Gary, is having a topic, and sometimes it's okay to veer away from it, but I always think some structure is worth having.
So just Connor, just before you jump in,
go on.
Just pick up on something with James, or in fact with anyone. That's a really interesting point, because we've already got two different ways of thinking here, haven't we, in terms of coaching to objectives and then actually allowing it to flow naturally away from objectives potentially and having more flexibility with that. James, how often do you, or sorry, not how often, but how do you plan the design of your practices in relation to your topic or your objectives? Because if you're going to allow more flexibility, then quite clearly that has an impact on how you design your practices, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I think the thing I was just going to say, that the first thing I consider when I'm designing the practice is who am I coaching? And that's obvious, because you might be with a group of players or kids or adults, whatever age you should for 2-3 years and you know them intrinsically, but you might be coaching a session with a newish team or covering for someone else, or starting a new role, and I think you have to know who the players are to then be able to even start to address topics or a session within a curriculum or hitting a specific target. And once you know that, then I think you can start to think about the topic and then the actual structure of the design as well. So I think what I've found is that over time I've brought more flex in the delivery of them, I suppose. So kind of as approaching certain things out, you'll build a bigger toolbox. So and ultimately, I think what I've come back to is just thinking, keep it relatively simple. So the thing I always think about is this: as long as it's realistic, so quite a few R's I think you can use, but realistic or relatable to the game that you're coaching, or the game that your players will play on a Saturday or match, you can't go too far wrong. So structurally nowadays, that's kind of my threshold. As long as my session is relative and relatable to the game that they're going to be playing, I'm kind of happy. I will have some specific things, and like I said, that depends on which group it is. So the county representative players, they probably have slightly different. We have slightly different team expectations and team goal, ambitions and goals to say the grassroots teams at Keynsham Town. So, and then equally the younger players, it will be different in terms of what you're hoping to target and maybe how specific you can get. And as you get older with players and perhaps they're more experienced, then I think you can really start to hone into stuff. So my lads, they play at Bristol Rovers. Their sessions, they're more frequent for starters. They're more specific quite often, but they still have some fairly open sessions as well. The kids at Keynsham Town, we get them for 90 minutes a week. So that 90 minutes can't be spent doing really specific technical drill for the whole of it, because they'll just miss out on so many other aspects. So apologies, I think I've just kind of dumped everything that kind of comes to mind, but it's a big area. It's a really big topic, isn't it?
Yeah. James, that was really useful. And there's a few things there I'd like to pick up on a bit more as we go through this. I know Connor was itching to speak, so I'll back out and let him jump in. But just really quickly, James, I don't know if the others are finding this as well. Your signal's kind of in and out.
Yeah.
So I don't, if you know of that in your house, if there's somewhere else you can go, or if you just turn your video camera off when you talk, and we'll see if that solves it next time. And kind of, I don't know, but you're kind of lagging in and out a little bit, just to be aware. Okay.
I'll try and fix it.
But what you
I'll
said,
go on mute and see if I can fix it. Cheers.
Okay, cool. Connor, back to you.
Yeah, I think it's just building on what James said there, really, and kind of context is always going to be king, really, with this. And whether we're working with senior players or whether we're working with individuals, whether we're working kind of in the elite game or whether we're working in grassroots, the players that we're working with and that specific context will ultimately drive what the session design looks like. And kind of recognizing what the individuals need as part of that. So whether you're coaching to objectives, whether you're coaching to kind of the players turning up and letting it go organically, it's trying to tie it in with what you're trying to achieve from that session. So you might have an objective which you're really focused on. That objective might not be technical, tactical for that session. You might have a completely different focus. And the model which I'm thinking back to, Lee, is obviously the one that we got introduced to at the mentoring days. So the one from, I can't remember what it's called. It's the Muir one, which is essentially around how the objectives link into kind of curriculum, and then out of the objectives comes kind of your session design, your behaviours, and then obviously like Whitey said about the engagement as well.
Okay, excellent. So we've spoken a lot about objectives, and we've spoken a lot about engagement and engaging individuals or the group, which are really interesting points in terms of how we structure sessions and also how we design practices. But I just want to delve a little bit deeper then in relation to objectives. So we come up with some objectives. How do we then decide which practice designs are going to be suitable for our sessions then? What's our kind of line of thinking to go from a topic or objectives through to drawing some designs down on paper?
I'm different. See, I don't tend to pre-session. I don't tend to design on paper. I tend to go in with a rough idea in my head, let it roll out, and kind of go off the cuff.
What's that idea built on them?
What is it built on?
Yeah, because that's quite interesting. So you go with a rough idea, but obviously that rough idea requires some form of planning.
Yeah,
it might be quite loose, but there's planning attached to that. So what kind of steps do you go through to get to that stage where you've got a rough idea in your head?
I think probably a couple of days before, or even on the day of the session, or we'll discuss as maybe a coaching side what sort of things we want to look at, and then you kind of get an idea of what, number one, your availability is going to be like, or what the space you're working in. That has a massive influence on what you're going to work on. And I think from there, I think we just tend to get a picture of how roughly you want it to look, or what sort of objectives you're looking at, and then I'll probably just flip it in my mind and adapt it from there, and go with like an introductory or intro practice, and then just evolve it. And it might look messy, and often there's quite a lot of player involvement in that. So I guess going without a specific area size, for example, it might be quite too tight or too big. And I think just having trust in the players, and even asking the players how they want to adapt it, that's into how I go in with it. So it's not very rigid and quite flexible, if you like. And so it's slightly different how I tend to work. So I'll probably not answer the question as such, but
I'm intrigued what you've said. It's different. So why do you think that's different?
I just see probably in the profession, a lot of coaches will work off coaching manuals, or they'll write a lot of stuff down pre-session and take it with them, and that works for them. And I've just never worked that way. I don't like having a set, rigid either syllabus to work from or something set, because I don't find it very adaptable, flexible. And I've always been quite an adaptable and flexible person, because my mind tends to drift and wander, and I like to experiment. And I guess just me as a person, that's the way I am. So that's why it's never worked for me, that approach.
So that's your personality coming out in your coaching. Go on, James. Go on.
Well, I was going to say that's what I was going to say, Lee, is that hopefully for your students and from people listening to this, what they'll realise is that there isn't really a right or wrong way of planning or delivering. The right or wrong way really has to fit you. So as well as knowing the players or the people you're going to be coaching, I think knowing yourself is quite an important first step. So there's probably no point, or you're probably going to limit your chances of success if you try to coach in a style that isn't yours or doesn't suit you. And the styles, I think, letting it go. If you think about the types of teachers you've had, the most effective ones for me were the ones who were like just really natural, and the ones who kind of tried to force it. You could always sort of tell they're comfortable, and the ideas and the communication doesn't come out as well. So I think what you're saying, Whitey, is brilliant. I think I'm more like that today, but when I started, I used to take comfort from having a piece of paper or a plan, or being quite, X's and O's, as well as lots, a bit of preparation. I think I've relaxed a little bit, but that's probably just sort of comes over time. Having had some shocking sessions maybe where I didn't plan enough, but everyone's different.
It's a safety net, isn't it, James? It's like if you've got something to work from, it's safe, it's comfortable. You can see it visually on, say, a piece of paper, and then you can replicate it visually in practice. And I guess it's like a leap of faith if you go away from that, it's dangerous. Well, you can see it as quite dangerous thing to do, but it's experimental, and it might be like one of the worst sessions in the world. Well, you might think it might be, but the players wouldn't know any different if you're going from a piece of paper or fresh in your mind. It's like, and you've got to learn like what works for you, and it takes time. And that's the key thing, is it takes time to find out what sort of a coach you are to design your sessions.
How much time? How long did it take you?
Ever evolving. I'll be different now in 5 years' time than I was 5 years ago, if that makes sense. And I think I'm just continuously adapting. So I don't think I'd say I've become this coach in this amount of time. It's just evolved, and it is still evolving.
I think there's a big point that James made as well. Like, knowing yourself is key within this, and understanding what your philosophy is and kind of what you're comfortable with is going to be a massive driver in how you design your sessions as well. So like Whitey, obviously, like kind of basing off of that, and this is a bit of an assumption, but it's more open to complexity, kind of multiple outcomes as part of a session. Whereas if we were planning literally from a kind of reams and reams of plans, and you've got to stick to the plan, that almost goes down the route of it being kind of a right or a wrong way of kind of delivering that session. So your coaching philosophy is kind of coming out quite clearly in how we would plan those sessions.
What do you mean by coaching philosophy? If you just briefly introduce that for us.
Yeah, so going a little bit deeper than kind of what's introduced on kind of the FA level ones and level twos, and starting to think about what our relationship is with first of all knowledge, but then also reality as well. So in terms of knowledge, do we see ourselves as the coaches as the holder of knowledge, and we're there to pass that down to the players? Or do we see it as the players holding that knowledge and kind of almost developing their own way through kind of the minefield that is sport? And then similar with kind of the reality side as well, is it multiple realities where kind of there's multiple ways of achieving a goal, and individual players might kind of find different ways through that? Or is it kind of one way, right or wrong, everything's black and white? And I think that our session design falls out of that massively.
So there's some really interesting points there. So we spoke, Gary, you mentioned the word empowerment earlier. So we're talking about power there, aren't we, Connor? So who's got the power in the coaching session? Is it on the coach? Is the coach the authority, and they're in charge, almost like an old school teacher? They're in charge of the session. You're in charge of the kids that you coach or the people you coach, and therefore you have to give them knowledge, or you have to develop them. Or are we looking at this differently, where we're saying, actually, they're the players, they know what to do, they've been playing this sport for a certain number of years, they see the sport through their own eyes, so what we need to try and do is understand their way of playing sport, rather than dictating to them how to play. We're asking them to understand how they play, and we're just trying to, if we understand that better from them, we might be able to be more helpful. Is that kind of aligned to what you were saying?
Yeah, I think there was a big one that I saw was the coaches stepping into the players' environment, which is like one of the perfect ways of saying it, really. It's we're there to support them, and we're kind of there to either aid their fun and their engagement levels, or to develop them as a player. But ultimately, it's their environment, it's their game.
So, and there's some really interesting points there. I just want to think about, because it's starting to relate to the next question. How do we typically design practices then? Because we spoke about what's important to us, and we started to talk about the processes that we go through to get to that practice design. But what does a typical practice design look like for you? What's your go-to? What if we went and watched your sessions? Typically, there will be very similar ways of designing your practices, because that's what you prefer as a coach. That's your style of coaching, I guess. What would your sessions look like? So, and you can use whatever language you want here, or you can just describe it. But yeah, what would a Gary? You start us off. What would a Gary session look like?
I want us to keep the tempo. I want my session to be high tempo as much as I can. It's a bit different. I know the players who are coming in. I know in advance the numbers I'm going to get. My sessions are quite laid out as regards to what I'm going to get. So it's a slightly more easier to plan, whether it be, unless I was in let's say I'm do another 12 session a weekend, I don't know what numbers I'm going to get. So that could be a bit more potluck in regards to that. So the idea of having numbers and ideas of the level of player that was going to come in helps me with the idea of the practice. So I would want to start with some type of game, always small-sided as much as I can, but that game is going to be related to the theme I want to achieve, or the outcome that we want to achieve. Throughout the rest of the practice. So I would go with a game, then I would break down maybe a specific skill within that game. So we've had some themes we use some team termly themes from a technical standpoint. So, for example, for the first term, we're going to be focusing heavily on shooting and passing. So within that, even within a game, we might have, there still will be a reminder of the focus of the shooting and passing. But once we've done, let's say we've done our warm up, we then might go specifically to, okay, let's really work on our shooting now, okay, and then start adding constraints, decision making within that. And then for the rest of the practice, it starts to build up for going small-sided, increasing the numbers, and it ends up usually playing 5-on-5. I want them to play as much as they can, especially for the players I'm only getting for a limited amount of time for the week, and that's, they want to play. So, and when they play, then we're going to start to really build in a bit more tactical. using questions, getting the whiteboards out, making it as interactive as possible. We're fortunate enough that we can use a big computer, and we've got cameras, so we can go and rewind and show replays. But I want to keep the session flowing, so I don't want to stop too much.
If you've only got them for a certain amount of time, Gary,
yeah,
why do you want them to play?
Because at the end of the day, when we go, we want to play, and I think that it's very hard to replicate what they're going to do at the weekend, and that's play. So put them in a situation where they're going to play, but have specific focuses within that, so they start to understand and deal with the pressures, deal with decision making, deal with having to, okay, what do I do in this situation? We have a way of how we want to play as well. So it's continuously reinforcing that and giving them the understanding of why we doing this, and then we're trying to work on how on what do we need to include within that.
What are the other people's thoughts in the room then? That's really interesting, Gary, and quite a few things have jumped out there that I might pick back up on if other people don't naturally anyway. But what do we think in the room? Or should I pick someone? Or should I go back to Gary? What do we reckon? Gary,
sorry, I was just talking on mute there, Lee.
Go on then. Don't worry, I've done it several times.
I was just getting into it, and I was like, "Why are you ignoring me?" Yeah. No, I was just going to say. Sorry. I was really interested hearing from a coach of another sport, actually, there, Gary. And basketball, shares quite a lot of similarities with football in the aims and the intrusion game sort of aspect of it. But I'm interested that so many of the concepts that you talked about there, all the elements are really similar to ones that I would be looking to get out, which is lots of game time or small side or practices that are actually in the format of a small sided game, because that I suspect the reason is probably similar that you do it, Gary, is that you'll get repetition and everyone will get loads of touches, but you also get the decision making, the ever evolving problems and pictures changing on the pitch, the ability, the need to work off the ball and the need to cooperate and coordinate with teammates. That if you just do practices with cones the whole time, or practices without any opposition, or practices with you might get returns in maybe just the one area of the technical the technical corner, but perhaps not the more important elements of tactical and psychological and decision making. So I was just interested, and I suppose it's reassuring to hear that other sports have similar themes running through them, and my sessions hopefully would have a lot of that, lots of small-sided stuff, lots of problem solving, warm-ups that are have got a fun element but a competitive element. So competition is just another thing I look to have all the way through the session as well, so not just passing and following your pass for the sake of it, but counter passes, who's going quickest, two teams together, even if it's just for fun. I think that drives motivation up in sessions.
And I think the competition is huge, and it for me it depends on where we are in the season as well. Obviously we're a bit more performance based, I would say, even though it's not all about results. That's far from it. But I would ramp up the practice. I would mess with them a little bit as regards to I would change the rules. I would completely try and make teams unfair on purpose, just to see how they react as well. As long as they are aware of that, and I won't at start. I want to see if they can deal with that situation, because they're going to have to deal with that in a game too, right? So there's going to be times where the referee's going to call something against them that they're going to disagree with. How are they going to deal with it? And I think that when we design our practices, sometimes I am designing a practice that is going to be chaotic as it can be, just to create a reaction and to see how they deal with that. So sometimes, like what Alex said, my practice can sometimes flip and completely go a different direction, but in a positive way.
And also, I think people are so worried about having how their sessions look to other people. So whether it be parents watching on the sidelines, how it looks to players, how it looks to other coaches, people are worried and conscious about their session looking perfect to the outside world, when in reality it's like they say in a messy classroom is a good classroom, isn't it? It's like it doesn't have to, it, as long as you get the outcome from what your players need, you and your players need, doesn't matter how it looks. It could be as simple or as detailed as it wants. If it gets the desired outcome, it doesn't matter what it looks like.
So do your sessions quite often look messy then?
Oh, they're unpredictable. Yeah, they're really unpredictable.
Yeah.
So it can go range from one spectrum to the other, really. Just because that's the way I work. Like James said earlier, I like problem solving. I like players to come and not really know what they're going to get out of the session, and I'm quite excited to see what it looks like. So that's just, again, the way I work.
It takes time to be confident in that, though. It does take time, because when you see, when people come through the door and say, you feel like you're being judged, like, one-off thing, and it actually, learning takes place when it's messy. It takes place when there's missed opportunities of and it's also important with, I don't know if this is along the right lines, but it's how you're feeding back or feeding forward to these players. So it's okay if they're in that environment. It's okay if the ball's going to go out, but it's reacting from that. Okay, why what has happened there? And how are you going to take that forward? So, yeah.
Gary, do you mind expanding on? There's a saying you said in there which is really, really intriguing. Learning is messy. So what do you mean by that?
Well, nothing's gonna be perfect. So you take in my sport, for example, you take a layup. It's, first of all, you want them to learn how to get the footwork right, and then the finish. But how often in a game are you going to have a closed opportunity? It's always going to be open. There's always going to be different decisions that happen to be made. So as soon as they start to understand, okay, here's how I do this, it's then starting to add in some guided defense, maybe some stronger defense, and getting them to understand about why are they missing. Keep reinforcing, okay, it's because you did this or you did that. It's nothing wrong with it being a bit scatty, first of all, because especially if they're learning something new, especially with like footwork, for example, or it can be anything. It doesn't matter. It's as long as they are aware of that, and as long as they know this is where you're going to get to eventually with it.
So all of you are highly experienced, highly qualified coaches working with good levels of performers. What about if you were coaching new performers, new participants? They're new to the sport. Would your practice designs change?
I think it goes back to the context, and it could be someone who is completely new to the sport in general, where then I'd probably go more the games and more the kind of the real fun engagement, trying to give them that hook to come back to a session, or whether it's a player who is coming back into the sport or is learning something new for the first time. I think that my approach would vary dependent on knowing that player and knowing that context.
So the example I'm thinking of is, so we'll think of a random sport. So we'll go tennis. If you've got a tennis player that you're coaching and they can't serve, how are you going to improve that? So if they're new to serving or they're new to the sport altogether, chaos and fun and all of this stuff all sounds wonderful, but would you then go back to a really rigid practice design and do lots of repetition of technique, or would you stick to what you've been saying in terms of kind of unstructured fun games and all of that stuff? Where would you go if you were in that environment?
The tennis example, Lee, I think you can apply it to anything. The building blocks, the technical building blocks of any action, any skill, any motor, motor action that we perform, you have to have the building blocks. And so somewhere, a player of a sport is going to have to, if they want to improve, is going to have to work on those. But does, like, fine-tuning your serve have to happen in every single week for the majority of the session with a coach, or could it be introduced early with some expert tips and it's introduced, and then it's picked up in a kind of, the player takes responsibility for the technique in, those periods between coaching sessions. That's with football. We definitely, when I'm working with really, really young players, a section of the session will be spent showing them how to perform a technical skill, whether it's, really basic, like just how to dribble the ball with the outside of your foot with a soft touch, or just how to use a different part of the surface of your foot to do a drag back or something. I'll actually break it down, show them the move. But I'm not going to labour on that every single week for really lengthy periods of time. I think you've got to drip those bits in at the right time, in the right kind of, if you're doing a recipe, it's just putting the right ingredients in at the right time, and then basically trying to give them the skills to then, or the motivation to go off and practice those bits in their own time, so that when they're with you in the kind of the group coaching setting, you can actually start to introduce the more chaotic and variable elements of it. But I don't think you can skip them. I think what I'm trying to say is it's a mix, and how quickly you move on from one of those things into the more game-related stuff just depends on the individual, the group, how fast they adapt and things like that. Some kids don't do a lot of practice at home, so you could spend all the time in the world teaching them how to serve a tennis ball. But if that's the only time they do it once a week, they're probably not going to make any progress in the game.
I think I'd agree on that. I think it goes back to what do the players need and at what time. So if they are completely new to a skill and they've got no kind of knowledge or no kind of skill ability within that, if we throw them straight into a game, then they're potentially going to fall flat on their face and kind of not develop the confidence and ultimately not develop any kind of knowledge of how to actually complete that skill. And I think that's, if you'd asked me this kind of 2-3, well, not even that, probably 6 months ago, if you'd asked me this, I'd say I'd always coach by games. So that player who couldn't serve a tennis ball, I would say I'm going to coach him through games. Whereas I think it's probably shifted in the last couple of months towards it being more of a, it depends. And I know that that's a phrase which you've come across, Lee, is it depends on the players, it depends on the context, it depends on what we're trying to develop with those players. So if they've got no knowledge and they've got kind of no background, then I might go more directive, I might go more blocks with that. But I know that kind of in the coaching world, that kind of blocked practice has almost been pushed out and almost viewed as outdated, or coaches that are using it as dinosaurs. But if the players need it at that time, then the players need it at that time.
So the modern way of coaching is games. The old way of coaching is drills.
Yeah.
And actually there might be a place for the old way of coaching after all. Even though the last 5 years people in coaching have been saying that's rubbish, never do it, there actually might be so it's being able to rationalize, being able to explain why you're picking your approach rather than saying this is the only way or this is the way I would always do it. It's just being able to explain this is why I've picked this particular design. But typically, Connor, you would do more game-based, I'm guessing.
Yeah, traditionally I would have gone more games-based, but now it's starting to think, and I'm not sure whether the students will cover this, around the different approaches and what the different approaches kind of bring out, and what we're really trying to develop with the players as well.
Okay, some really insightful conversations, some really interesting conversations, but I'm slightly cautious of time, so I do want to move us on to the next question, which is very directly linked, but we're going to flip it around now. So rather than what type of practices do you typically use, can we look at it the other way? Which practice design types do you avoid and why? So if we went to watch one of your sessions, whilst you're saying it depends, Connor, and that's great, I'd like you to just kind of stick your neck out and say, well, actually, these are the types of designs I probably rarely use. There might be a place for them, but rarely in my sessions do these types of practices exist. So who wants to start us off? I'm guessing not Whitey by that facial expression.
No, come back to me.
So I don't mind putting my neck on the line. I'll go for it. So I'd probably say the one that you wouldn't see very often is kind of almost going down the teaching games for understanding route and kind of coming away from the sport, but then coaching to simply the principles of play. I tend to go down the constraints kind of route, really. So kind of if I'm working at Cribs, kind of you'd rarely see me come up with a game that might incorporate basketball or netball or rugby into a session.
So you stick purely to football?
Yeah, I think that's potentially through not fully understanding TGFU though.
Which is teaching games for understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Gary, any typical practice or any practice designs that you just avoid using or you rarely use them?
I think I definitely go along the lines of everything has constraints, so there are rules and stuff like that. So, but yeah, similar to Connor in a way of more because I don't really see or get how it would link in with me with regards to teaching games for understanding, because I was all for it first of all because I thought, oh, that's the way forward. But actually, because of the time elements that we have, I want to be okay. Let's get going. Let's have an understanding. Let's play. So yeah, it's a tough one really. All my practices always want to be. I want them to be challenging, but I want them to be fun. So I'm thinking all the time, what's going to be boring. So I don't want to do too much block practice, even though Connor said yes, there's a time and place for it. I completely agree because I always allocate, I would say, 10 minutes to squarely on shooting, but I'm not going to say, right, you're just going to be doing this repetition all the time, because I would then be finding some type of constraint to go into it. So yeah, I would avoid too much of a blocked practice because I personally think it would be boring for them.
So do you have other people in the room? So Gary, it sounds like you do some of that kind of really early isolated type practices where in basketball they just do shooting, but only for like 5-10 minutes.
Only for 5-10 minutes because there's a specific area where it's got to be consistent. But more than anything else, that's always different as regards to I'm giving them different pieces of information because I want them to go home and practice on their own. So I'm not going to do something that I think is just going to be just to tick a box. There's something for a reason. So if I'm doing that, it's to give them pieces of information. I'm drip feeding them in. So that's changing every week.
So other people in the room, do you ever do practices, or how often do you do practices where you're looking at something in isolation? So in Gary's case, talking about shooting in basketball. So you could think of different techniques or different skills in football where you literally just do that. James, you gave the example with the young ones of dribbling with the outside of their foot. So how often do you do practices which are really narrow in focus and lack opposition, and they're just literally practicing the skill over and over again?
Very rarely in isolation, I would say. It nearly always just forms a part of a practice where I want to then see them take it into some sort of opposed game realistic sort of setting. And when you do that, you immediately introduce all the other aspects of the game. So, you know, if it's dribbling, they're going to lose the ball. So I want them in a situation where they're going to have to go and win it back as well. So you've got like kind of loads of other concepts around pressing and and counter-attacking and all that type of stuff being introduced. I don't think I've ever done a session where it's just one solid topic for the whole of it. But then there may be coaches in the professional game who have the time and the resources and the luxury to do that, and it's right for their players. And you'll probably see. Quite often watch the FA videos of England training. I think they're really good, but I've stopped watching them to try and take things that I can go and take to Kingston Town under nines, because the two settings are so different. You'll sit and watch the strikers just pinging unopposed shots into the corner against mannequins, and if you looked at that and thought, wow, that's how Harry Kane's become so good, and if you didn't realise that actually that's just part of a week-long syllabus, that's because he's doing everything else in there, you might misinterpret that level of specific training. So rarely would one session be that specific. I think the other thing that you rarely see me do, not for want of being able to. But quite often we talk about the design, the actual, the parameters of your design, the size and the space, the shape and things like that. And we often talk about whether you want to use, your lines on the pitch, so your horizontal thirds or your vertical thirds and things like that. And I just rarely ever seem to have the luxury of having enough space to kind of do that in a realistic way. So I don't think I've ever had a full pitch to train on. With juniors, you just don't get that luxury. So I quite often think, oh yeah, I see lots of guys and they're doing a practice where they've got like Pep Guardiola's sort of, quarters and, spaces, the middle space and stuff like that. And I just don't, I've never had the opportunity to do that. So maybe one day. Yeah.
You're having a dig at Whitey now, aren't you? Because he gets to do that.
I can only dream of it one day.
We get 2 pitches sometimes.
Oh, showing off. Whitey.
What if we come to watch you over and over again, what would we rarely see?
I don't know, because as I think I said before, it's quite varied and quite unpredictable. Like we'll often break off and do individual stuff. So if you've got the facilities and number of coaches and players to do it, then going from what we just speaking about a minute, we'll sometimes go and do that. I don't know. I honestly don't know what because I've pretty much like to trial and error everything. And if it works, I'll come back to it. If it doesn't, I might find another way to come back to it. I'd just like to try stuff. So I don't think there is anything. There's stuff that hasn't worked. Don't get me wrong. There's stuff that hasn't worked, and I thought I'm never going to try it again. But then I've always fancied trying to win it, if that makes sense. Trying to improve it and not let it beat me.
Yeah.
So I don't really know, to be honest.
Okay, excellent. Just into the final question then. So, what advice would you give to a new coach or a less experienced coach than yourself? So they don't have to be very new, but someone's less experienced than yourself or new in regards to practice design. So what you spoke about tonight's been quite high level, quite very insightful. But obviously you wouldn't have spoke about this if you were in your first, second or third year of coaching. You've got to this stage for a long period of time. So if you were going to give some advice to a more novice coach, what would that be? If anyone's brave enough to go first, because that's come to mind, please do. So I'm sure a few of you will need some thinking time about that.
Go on.
No, you go.
I would say have belief and have confidence in what you're delivering, and have that come across to the players, but also have the open-mindedness to admit that it's not working and be open with the players about that. So coach with confidence and believe in what you're doing, but don't be afraid to adapt or admit if it's not working, because players will respect that.
And even ask for help as well.
And ask for help. Yeah.
Good. Like that. Gary, go on then, your turn.
No, very similar. Put yourself in the player's position. I do that a lot, thinking, if I'm a player now, am I having fun? Am I learning? Does it relate to a game? Especially if it's your first session, are you going to come back? But yeah, don't be afraid to ever think, right, this is not working. Let's move on. Don't be afraid, and don't be afraid of admitting that to the players as well. I think that helps build a relationship as well, because we're all human at the end of the day, and nothing's perfect.
I'd say be resilient, basically. So don't be afraid to fail, because we've all done that loads of times as coaches. Don't let that put you off, but be curious as well. So go out and watch as many other coaches as you can, watch as many other practices, check the research, watch as much. You're always learning as a coach, basically, as well as coaching, ironically. So it's you don't feel like you have to be perfect straight away. It just is, you're doing your best, and as long as you are doing that, your players will not come to any harm, basically. But just get out there and don't be afraid to try stuff out.
Thank you, James. And Connor?
Yeah, I think it's probably the biggest one for me is trying to think of it not as a show. So you're there for the players. You're trying to make them better or make their experience better. You're not there to put on a show for the parents or someone there watching the session. Secondly, probably trying to avoid pushes towards one approach. So if it's not right for the players to go through games, then kind of avoiding pushes towards that one approach and figuring out what's best for the players. And then finally get out there and get some experience. We've probably all, I think everyone has probably learned more through the experiences we've had than what we ever learn on a kind of a formal coaching qualification, really.
If you went and asked a coach if you could watch their session to learn something, no coach I've ever come across would ever say no. So that has helped me loads. I've sort of pinched stuff off people. You could call various people mentors, but I think the best thing about the coaching courses that I've done with the FA and various places isn't necessarily the technical content on the sessions, although that is good, but it's meeting other coaches like you guys, like just really experienced people, and that has accelerated a lot of learning for me. It's just sort of asking them questions, going to watch and soaking it up basically. So I'd agree with that.
And sorry, just to build on that again, I think it's you'll probably get more from going and watching someone in a similar boat to you than you will from going on YouTube and watching a Pep Guardiola session or like a Greg Popovich session. Like get it out there, see what it's like on the grass, because that's where it's real.
Excellent. That's going to conclude. I'm going to offer one piece of advice, which is nowhere near the quality of the piece of advice that you four have offered. But mine would just be simply just to enjoy it, particularly if you're in the early stages. I think back to my coaching experience early on, and I used to coach quite grumpy all the time because I didn't really enjoy being there. I felt out of my comfort zone. I felt like I was being watched. I felt quite nervous and anxious, and therefore I really didn't like it. And lo and behold, sometimes the kids didn't like it because that rubbed off on them because I wasn't having fun. The session design wasn't fun, and therefore, actually, I think back with quite negatively about some of my early experiences where I probably have had a negative impact on some people where they've dropped out of playing sport altogether because of my coaching manner. So have fun with it. Go and enjoy, go and smile. And like going right back to what you said at the start, Whitey, bring your personality out in it. If you're quite a bubbly character, be like that as a coach. You don't have to be ultra professional all the time. You need to be who you are as a person. But that's not as good as the other piece of advice that the other coaches here have shared. So that concludes. Thank you for listening. More importantly, to the four of you, thank you for your contributions. They were really insightful. If there's any questions that come back from any of the students, or I'm probably going to come up with some, I might bank some your way to see what you think. But really thankful, particularly for giving up your evening. And yeah, if it's come off well, then maybe we'll do something like this again. But thank you very much.